There are some spectacular Roman sites in North Africa, but Dougga, Tunisia, ancient Thuga, has a fair claim to be the most impressive of all, a city both typically Roman and completely unique. Originally a Numidian and Carthaginian settlement, Dougga became part of the Roman Empire under Caesar. Its population was always mixed, with Roman colonists living alongside local Berbers. This diversity was reflected both in the city's layout, which never acquired the regularity we tend to associate with the Romans, and in its monuments, where Roman and Numidian, Latin and Punic, coexist. We'll begin with the theater. The building dates to the middle of the 2nd century and was the gift of a wealthy citizen. It was relatively small, with about 3,500 seats, but that was enough to hold most of Dougga's population, which probably never much exceeded 5,000. The stage building has vanished, except for this re-erected columnar screen, allowing us this fine view of the valley in the Capitolium. The center of the Roman city, a short distance from the theater, consisted of 2 adjacent squares, one on each side of the Capitolium, the temple on the right side of your screen. On the far side of the Capitolium was the Forum, which we'll visit in a moment. Nearer to us was the so-called Square of the Windrose, named after a compass cut into its pavement that showed the names of the 12 winds. This square dates to the late 2nd century, as most of the structures that surrounded it. The most famous building in Dougga is the well-preserved Capitolium. Dedicated to the Capitoline triad, Jupiter, Juno, and Minerva, this is yet another product of the prosperous 2nd century. Like most Roman temples of this era, it's Corinthian. The relief on the pediment shows the soul of an emperor being carried to the heavens by an eagle. Let's take a closer look at the Capitolium. Now, as you can see, the cella, where the gods' statues were displayed, is remarkably well preserved. In fact, the door is still standing to its lintel and its awesome height. And the walls of the cella, which would have been stuccoed and plastered originally, were built in the so-called opus Africanum style, with large stone supports and rubble packed between. In the rear wall of the cella, we see the spaces, the niches, that held the 3 statues of the gods honored here: Jupiter in the center, Juno and Minerva on either side. This is Dougga's Forum. Like the Square of the Windrose on the other side of the Capitolium, it dates to the 2nd century. During the 6th century, the Byzantine general Suleiman converted it into a fortress, within which the local residents could take refuge when raiders came from the desert. Suleiman's men scavenged stone from local buildings to erect the walls you see on each side of the Forum. Unfortunately, this involved the destruction of many of Dougga's early Roman monuments. From this perspective, behind the Forum, you can see how the Capitolium was incorporated directly into the Byzantine fort, which is probably why it was not destroyed for its stone. Here, among the olive groves beyond the Capitolium, is the monumental arch of Alexander Severus, set up to commemorate that emperor's grant of new privileges to Dougga. The niches in the upper part of this arch carried bronze statues of the emperor and his family. Not far from the arch of Alexander Severus, and dating to the same period, is the imposing temple of Juno Caelestis. This was a much more expensive and imposing building than the Capitolium, ringed by a portico of tall Corinthian columns and framed by a semicircular colonnade. Juno Caelestis was the thinly Romanized version of the Punic goddess Tanit. It's likely that the colonnade behind the temple recalled the crescent moon, one of Tanit's symbols. These are the Licinian Baths, completed during the reign of Caracalla in the early 3rd century. Here, almost uniquely, we have some mosaics preserved in situ. Most of Dougga's mosaics were taken off to the Bardo in Tunis. The highlight of these baths is the Frigidarium, the cold bathing room. This was a long and narrow hall, originally with a high vaulted roof, and it's now remarkable for its spectacular views off to the valley on one side, and if we turn, we can now see, with the roof gone, the Capitolium. The service tunnels beneath the baths, used to supply the furnaces with fuel, are also quite well preserved. As you can see, they were vaulted and built with rubble. Beside the baths is this theater-like structure, which seems to have been designed to house the sacred dramas of Liber Pater, an epithet of Bacchus, here assimilated to the Punic god Shadrach. The god's temple was on the terrace just above. Just downslope from the Licinian Baths and the temple of Liber Pater are the Cyclops Baths, named after a mosaic that's now in the Bardo. The highlight here is a very well-preserved latrine, which we are entering now. Well, here it is in all of its glory. There are 12 seats in a nice horseshoe arrangement. As you can see, the seats have the classic keyhole shape, probably designed so that you could fit your sponge on a stick beneath your legs discreetly. The channel here, at their feet, was probably designed so you could dip your sponge and moisten it for ready use. This is the largest of Dougga's excavated houses. Known as the House of the Trifolium, after the shape of one of its dining rooms, it used to be said that this was the city brothel, because of those small cell-like rooms around the central courtyard. There is, however, no evidence for this. Almost certainly we have here a classic Roman domus, with a peristyle in the center and rooms around. Finally, at the bottom of the slope on which Dougga is built, we come to what might be the city's most intriguing monument. Before it was Roman, Dougga was a Numidian city, and here we have the imposing mausoleum of a Numidian prince. It may have been a cenotaph for Massinissa, the king who helped the Romans defeat Hannibal. Whoever was buried here, he received a spectacular tower tomb. This is a rare surviving example of Carthaginian-style architecture. As you can see, there are Greek elements, from the Ionic columns on the second stage to the sirens below the roof, positioned to ward off evil spirits. But the architecture is ultimately eclectic, with Phoenician, Egyptian, and even Persian influences, a neat epitome of the rich cultural mix in this small town at the edge of Roman Africa.